Give it another minute or so to let people join. Welcome, everyone. You see the participants continue to climb, so I'll wait a little longer.
Sure.
Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm James Prue, the Executive Officer of Technological Support Services for the Ottawa Carleton District School Board. Just a bit of housekeeping during the session. Please use the Q&A to post any questions, as the chat feature has been disabled, and we'll get to the questions towards the tail end of the webinar. So today, the Ottawa Carleton District School Board is partnering with Media Smarts to offer this virtual workshop for parents and guardians. Media Smarts is a Canadian nonprofit charitable organization based right here in Ottawa that focuses on digital and media literacy. Media Smarts has been developing digital and media literacy programs and resources for Canadian homes, schools, and communities since 1996. Their work provides adults with information and tools to help children and teens develop the necessary critical thinking skills for interacting with the media they love. Ottawa Carleton District School Board regularly leverages Media Smarts resources in the learning within our schools and classrooms. I have the pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Matthew Johnson, Director of Education for Media Smarts, Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. He is the author of many Media Smarts lessons, parent materials, and interactive resources. As a knowledge expert in digital literacy and its implementation in Canadian curriculum, Matthew is the architect of Media Smarts' Use, Understand, Create Digital Literacy Framework for Canadian K-12 schools. He has contributed blogs and articles to websites and magazines around the world, as well as presenting Media Smarts materials on topics such as copyright, cyberbullying, body image, and online hate to parliamentary committees, academic conferences, and governments and organizations around the world, frequently as a keynote speaker. Without further ado, here is Matthew Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Screen time is one of parents' top tech-related concerns, according to our own research at Media Smarts, and it's actually the most common cause of tech-related conflict between parents and young people in Canada. We know kids themselves are worried about their screen use as well. Almost half say that they spend too much time on their phones. So, what is the best way to address what's become one of our top concerns relating to media and technology? Well, you already got the introduction to Media Smarts, so I don't really need to tell you too much more about us before we go on. I do want to pause briefly to define what we mean when we talk about digital media literacy, because it really does encompass everything that we do. And it's the ability to critically, to effectively, and to responsibly access, use, understand, and engage with media of all kinds, whether that is traditional media, as traditional as books, up to the latest social network or AI. All of our resources and workshops are grounded in the best available evidence and research, including the original research that we conduct ourselves. we've been doing research on the digital lives of Canadians since 2000 in an ongoing study called Young Canadians in a Wireless World. It informs all the work that we do, and we will continue to inform policy and set benchmarks from research on children's digital lives. I'd also like to briefly share a few of the partners we work with in our approach specifically relating to youth and technology. I serve as a member of the Canadian Pediatric Society's Digital Health Task Force, and in that role, I was involved in developing the current guidelines for children's screen time. And that work, along with our own Young Canadians in a Wireless World research, forms the basis of the presentation that you'll be seeing in a moment. We also work with organizations like the Canadian Medical Association and Sick Kids Hospital, and we've worked extensively with different branches of the federal government, such as the Department of Canadian Heritage and the Ontario Ministry of Education, to develop educational resources for classrooms, homes, and community settings. So that's who Media Smarts is. I'll tell you very briefly who I am. You already heard I'm the Director of Education. I've been with Media Smarts for 16 years now. I'm also a dad of two boys. One's 13 and one's 16, and they're actually both in the OCDSB. They're at two different OCDSB schools. So this is very near and dear to my heart. And the issues that we're talking about today are ones that we have dealt with and, of course, are continuing to deal with as a family. The last thing I'll mention is I would encourage you, when you have a question, put it in the Q&A as soon as you think of it. I'll be taking questions at the end just to make sure that I time everything right and I get to all of the material that we're covering. But I don't want anyone to forget a question. So please, as soon as you think of one, put it in the Q&A. So you may have seen that the title of tonight's talk referred to tech habits. And there is a reason why at Media Smarts we talk about tech habits and why we avoid using the word addiction. And we know this is a widely used word, and we know it's one that young people will often use themselves to describe their own attitudes towards technology. But there are some reasons why we don't use that term. First of all, it's simply inaccurate. There's very little evidence that any of the devices or apps that we use are genuinely addictive in the way that substances like tobacco or even activities like gambling are. There are a small number of exceptions to that, which we can touch on later, but by and large, what we do with our devices does not meet the threshold of an addiction. But what's more important is that using the framing of addiction, thinking of it as an addiction, can actually backfire because it gives us an excuse to not do anything to change the role that screens play in our lives. Teens, as I mentioned earlier, will often readily admit to being addicted to their phones or to social media, but our research has actually found that kids who are worried about their screen time don't spend any less time online than kids who aren't. So gives us, using that framing of addiction, gives us an excuse to not change things relative to the idea, compared to the idea of talking about it and thinking about it in terms of habits. One of the people whose work we draw on very heavily is Dr. Michael Rich at the Digital Wellness Lab. And he puts it very well when he says that the label of addiction isn't helpful when it skews our response and fails to provide the young person with the means of righting a pattern of media use that has gone awry. When addiction is invoked, not only is the young person's strength of character questioned, but the label can give them permission to plead helplessness and succumb to its draw. And this, I should point out, is someone who works with the most severe cases, people who have sought out medical help and in some cases even been hospitalized due to issues they've had with devices. And he's someone who is very reluctant, except in very extreme cases, to use the term addiction. Thinking in terms of addiction also suggests that the only solution is abstinence. If we're addicted to something, then the only way we can solve our problem is to not use it at all. And of course, that's unrealistic when we consider that students need to go online for schoolwork, and almost all of them will eventually use devices for work. Not only that, but as parents, we as a group don't want to take their phones away. In fact, our research found 2/3 of kids say that they were given their first phone not because they asked for it, but because their parents wanted to be able to keep in touch with them. So that first phone, in 2/3 of cases, came from the parents. It was not the child's idea. So they have those phones because we want them to have those phones. So it's very difficult to turn around and say, you're addicted to that phone that I gave you. As well, unlike genuinely addictive substances, phones and social media provide kids with lots of benefits, from social connection to education to self-expression. And the research suggests that those youth who are most vulnerable to the harms of digital media also get the most benefit. So, with the exception of the very youngest kids, that's kids under 2, for whom really screen time of all kinds provides basically nothing of value. Um, the exceptions being video chatting with someone that they already know, like a grandparent or a parent who's maybe traveling or absent for whatever reason, or reading an ebook with a parent or another caregiver. With the exception of those very youngest kids, our goal is not to reduce screen time as much as possible, but to help them develop habits that will let them be in control rather than having the apps and the devices be in control. When we talk about screen time, what we're really worried about is displacement. That screen activities will take up time that would otherwise be spent with friends or family, or doing important things like exercising or getting enough sleep. This is why, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's important to keep screen time as close to 0 for kids under 2, because they need as much of all of those things as possible. And that's one thing I really want to highlight again, that under 2 media, except in those 2 cases, provides no benefit. No matter how educational an app or a TV show says it is, kids under 2 get nothing from screens, and it takes the place. It displaces the things that they do need. So it's essentially like giving them something to eat that doesn't have any nutrition and is making them too full to eat actual food. But for older kids above age 2, think about whether or not a screen activity is providing something that you don't want displaced. So is it delivering something? Is it an activity that you actually want? So for instance, is a screen activity helping them get exercise, like a dance game or Pokemon Go? And there are great free options there as well. There's a terrific app that we love called Merlin, which recognizes bird calls. So you can use it when you're out hiking. It's a great motivation to get outside. Is the screen activity helping them learn something, whether that's school related, whether it's one of your child's interests like history or dinosaurs, or something practical like cooking or playing guitar? Are our children making or creating something like writing a story or making a video game? And are they socializing in a meaningful way with friends or family members? Research has found that kids who mostly play video games alone are likely to become lonelier over time, while those who play with others become less so. So that's why context is so important. There's a world of difference between a child who is sitting there playing a video game by themselves and then someone who is playing a video game with other people that they know virtually. So friends from school, and they're playing together, even though they're in different places. And of course, the ideal case is when they're playing together with you or with friends or siblings in the same place physically, which makes it a social and a much more engaging, meaningful activity. But except when screen time or screen use is displacing important things, how you spend your time on screens and not how much time you spend online is the best predictor of issues like loneliness and well-being. different activities may have different effects than others. One study found that young users of social media typically felt worse after browsing other people's posts, but felt better after posting content themselves or after sending their own messages. But of course, we have to recognize that the apps and platforms that we use are not neutral. They have been carefully designed to make us spend more time on them and to come back to them more often. That's what app makers call sticky design. In the famous saying attributed to Marshall McLuhan, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. In other words, the way that we use these apps is influenced by how they're made, how they're designed. It doesn't control us. It doesn't determine how we use them, but it does shape it. And unfortunately, the things that make an app sticky are also some of the biggest benefits that we get from them. Exploring our identities, being entertained, self-expression, distraction. The good news, though, is that teaching kids about the design tricks that apps use to get us to keep checking them, everything from Snapchat streaks to TikTok's For You page, helps them take control of their own experience. So when kids learn how these apps are manipulating them, and this is true of adults as well, we all become better able to take conscious control over how we use them. In fact, a lot of research shows kids don't like the ways that apps manipulate them. In our research, the thing that came up again and again as something kids find unpleasant was Snapchat streaks. They felt manipulated, but they also had difficulty giving them up. So we can teach them ways to advocate for more healthful design. How we do that is to think in terms of the features of a tool, such as an app or a device, and that's what it can do. The features are the things that you can do with an app. The defaults are what is obvious or easy to do. Sometimes they're what happens unless you turn it off. So one way of learning how an app is motivating and manipulating you is to analyze it in that way. Think about what are the things that you can do with it, and what are the defaults that make it easy to lose track of time, that keep you coming back, or that make you use it longer. Then imagine how you might want to how you might want tech companies to change their products in any way that you wanted. So a good example, for instance, is autoplay. Most video apps are set up to autoplay. Netflix is set up to autoplay. YouTube is set up to autoplay. And again, we've heard from kids that they don't necessarily like this. They would prefer to have control over what comes up next. Many kids that we've talked to told us, for instance, either about losing track of time because of autoplay or about seeing unwanted content because of autoplay. So in many cases, if we ask them, if you had a magic wand and you could change YouTube, what would you change? They frequently would say that they would get rid of autoplay. But we don't have to wait. There are some things that we can't change, but in many cases, we can use these tools as though they had been changed. So for instance, you can turn off autoplay. Every now and then it'll switch it back on. And of course, you're going to have to do it on every different device where you access YouTube. Every tablet, every phone, every computer, you have to switch it off in each case. But you can do it. And that's going to promote a more mindful, a more healthful use. And you can do that same process. What are the affordances, the features, and the defaults that influence how we use it? How would we like to change those for more healthful use? And how can we use it as though they had been changed? And that is one of the simplest and most effective ways of being more mindful and taking control over how we use our devices. So now that we've established the goal, taking control, being more mindful, being conscious users and resisting the ways that apps manipulate us. Here's some more specific tips for building better tech habits. It is useful to take breaks from using devices, but a short break can be just as valuable as a digital detox. One study found that reducing time spent with devices had the same positive effect on depression and anxiety symptoms, on life satisfaction, and physical activity as not using devices at all. So just taking a short break had as big an impact as a so-called detox. And in fact, the group that reduced their time rather than trying to eliminate it were more likely to show positive effects 4 times later than those who had abstained totally. So not only did it have the same positive effect, but the positive effect was more long lasting to take short breaks compared to trying to cut it down to 0. Another study found the most effective approach was to try to reduce time spent on specific activities at particular times. So for instance, not viewing videos from the Up Next bar on YouTube, or not using Instagram while in the library. So pick one activity at a particular time or a particular situation to reduce and start there. That same study found that you also got positive effects if you plan to spend more time doing things they enjoyed online. So by identifying activities that they knew they enjoyed and planning to spend more time on those enjoyable activities, that actually displaced the activities that made them feel worse. So instead of trying to reduce screen time, it may be more effective to develop better tech habits by planning tech-free times for ourselves and our kids and having parts of our homes and routines that are tech-free. We recommend starting with the bedroom and the dinner table, keeping devices out of bedrooms. I'm going to come back to that, and not having devices at the dinner table and going from there. We have a lot of different resources that can help with that, including one called Co-Viewing with Your Kids that I can share a link with to later. Here's a more practical, well, not that the other one wasn't practical, but a more nuts and bolts activity that we're actually going to try doing together. And this is for dealing with what we call the phone loop. You may have experienced being caught in the phone loop, opening your phone to do one thing, then doing a half a dozen things before you realize what was happening. Maybe 10 minutes have gone by and you realize you haven't even done the thing you started out planning to do. How do we avoid the phone loop? We can do that by being more intentional with our phone use. Before we open our phones, say, this is what I'm going to do. So, for instance, check the weather. When you're first getting started with this, you may want to say it out loud, and then later on, you can just think your plan. But start by making a plan. What are you going to do? Next, set ahead of time how you'll know you're finished. When I know whether or not it's likely to rain, for instance. So I'm going to check the weather. When am I going to be done? When I know whether or not I need to bring a raincoat. And then say what you'll do right after you've finished it. Like, I'm either going to get a raincoat or I'm going to go get the sunscreen. This helps you avoid that in-between moment when your thumb might tap another app without you even thinking about it. So we're going to try that right now. We're going to try the Do Just One Thing challenge. Think about all the different things that you do with your phone. You can think of them either in terms of apps for email, each different social network account, and so on, or the reason why you're using your phone. Contacting your parents, checking the weather, checking in with your friends, or you can use a mix of both. What you want is to choose one that is finite, that has a clear end, like checking the weather, rather than something that has no built-in ending, like watching videos. So we're going to pick one of those. If you have a weather app on your phone, you can use that. That's a good one to start with. If not, think of something that you have on your phone. Maybe if you have a library app, you can check your holds. If you're expecting an email from someone, You can go to your email to see if that person has emailed you and read that email if they have. Now answer 2 questions. Why am I doing this? What's my goal here? For instance, to find out what the weather's going to be. And second, how will I know when I'm finished? When I know what the weather's going to be, when I know whether my hold has come in at the library, when I know whether or not that person has emailed me. Now, we're going to do it. Unlock your phone. Close any open apps. So if there are any open apps right now, just swipe them away. Now we're going to do just the activity you plan to do. I'm checking the weather. And as soon as we're done, I'm going to figure out right now what my kids are going to wear to school tomorrow. Oh, going up to 4 degrees tomorrow, but starting out at -2. So that tells me, all right, now I know what they're going to wear. Now I'm going to close the app and lock my phone. And I know that seems almost silly, but building habits, there's a whole science. There's as much science about habits as there is about addiction. And building habits is like building muscles. Every time you do a push-up, the next push-up gets a little easier. And it's exactly the same thing with habits. The only way habits stick is repetition. And even though it seems silly to do that, treat it like an exercise, that is how it works. And that's how we can train ourselves. That's how we can build the habits that we need to take control. So what do we do with activities with no obvious endpoint, like scrolling social media? So many of the things we do have no obvious endpoint. Probably those finite ones are the exception. So what do? In this case, we set a timer. Here's another activity you can try. This one we're not really going to be able to do together, but you can do part of it. So this one is an exercise we call app trials. So now we're going to pick one of the activities that has no natural end, like playing a game or watching videos. So there's a game I sometimes like to play where fruit drops down from the top of the screen and you try to combine it to make bigger fruit. It's kind of like Fruit Tetris. So that's my example, but it could be watching videos. It could be surfing your favorite social network, whatever. Decide in advance how much time you'd like to spend doing it. Let's say you're going to spend 5 minutes. You just want to relax for 5 minutes watching TikTok or whatever. Set a timer going with that time. Do the activity until the timer goes off, and then close that app and put your phone away. And it is that last part, actually going through with it. That's where we're building that muscle. That's where we're building the good habits, where you actually go through with it. But even if you don't stop when the timer goes off, timing what you're doing can be illuminating. So that game I mentioned earlier, I thought that I was spending about 5 minutes. I would play it every now and then just as a little break to relax. And I thought it was taking me about 5 minutes each time until I timed it. And it turned out every time I played it, I was spending about 15 minutes, which means that I was better at the game than I thought I was, but it also meant it was taking up a lot more time than I thought it was. And I don't play that game anymore because sometimes you do find there's no way an activity just is taking up too much of your time. So what you can do right now is take a moment to think of something you do online that has no natural end. A game you like to play on your phone, checking social media, watching a video app, something like that. And then just take a guess, just like I did. Take a guess how long each session usually is and write it down. You can write it down on your phone. You can write it down on a piece of paper. Doesn't matter. Next time you do it, time yourself and compare that time to your guess. And that's going to give you a sense of what role that activity is playing in your life, whether it's playing the role that you think it is, whether it's playing the role that you want it to play, because that guess you make is going to be about how much time you think it should take. Another way of limiting how much time we spend on our phones or other devices, and also becoming more mindful about them, is adding friction to our phone experience by doing things like regularly changing your unlock method or moving the most tempting apps off your home screen. So I use a pattern lock, but you can use a pin. It doesn't really matter what you use. And you can switch between methods. You can do a pattern lock for a while and then a pin and then facial recognition. What matters is that you're changing it often enough that it's conscious. You don't want it ever to get to the point where you can unlock your phone without thinking at all. When you're getting started at taking control, changing your color scheme to grayscale can also help. It's less stimulating. Notifications make us feel more stressed, but interestingly, they actually also make us feel more connected with other people. We spend less time responding to notifications than we may think we do. In fact, just 1 in 10 interactions with our phones are prompted by notifications. The other 9 in 10 times, we're the ones turning on the devices. So instead of turning notifications off completely, which may actually be more stressful, you want to do 2 things. First of all, you want to regularly audit, take a look at which apps are allowed to notify you and decide, do I really need in each case? Do I really need? Do you want weather notifications? Maybe you do. But with every app, basically every app you install is set to have notifications by default. And a lot of those you really don't need. So go through, go to your settings, go to notifications. It works a pretty similar way in both iPhone and Android devices. And then just go through all of the ones that have permission to send notifications when your phone isn't active. And then turn off ones that you don't need. But you are going to want to keep some of them. And the ones that you want to keep are the ones that are going to be the most powerful. A notification from an app that doesn't really have a reason to notify you, it's going to be annoying, but it's not going to be stressful. It is the notifications that we want to see. Things like text messages, things like social media updates. Those are the ones that actually cause stress. So we don't want to turn those off. What we want to do is set a schedule for when we'll check them. So to say, for instance, that a certain amount of time, 5 minutes of every hour, is going to be when we check our notifications. We can also set a schedule for when devices and specific activities are and aren't allowed. And that can be part of your household rules for how your kids use devices in the home. This can cover both times and places. So, for instance, bedrooms and the dinner table. So another exercise we were just talking about is notification sprints. Choose a frequency for checking your notifications. How often you're going to check them. It could be once every hour, once every half hour. It really depends. Start with something that you think is going to be easy. You always want to start with something that seems easy and then build your way up. Make sure you don't check any notifications outside of that time, except for ones that are clearly emergencies. So you can look at your phone, whatever device you're using, but don't actually go to that app unless it's clearly an emergency. When that time comes, so if you're doing it for 5 minutes out of every hour, when it's at 7:55, check all your notifications, respond to any that need responses as quickly as possible, and then put away the phone. We can also teach kids what's called the 10 minutes later method, and this comes from the science, again, of building good habits. Tell them that when they feel the desire to check their notifications, they can in 10 minutes. This delay reduces the number of times that they're going to check their phones, which may be more important than the total time they spend on it. It's also likely that something is going to happen in that 10 minutes to distract them from checking their phone. It's also really important that we set realistic goals for ourselves. As I said, we want to start with things that seem easy and work our way up to things that are more difficult. So sometimes that means you're not going to let yourself have access to a device in a case where a loss of willpower, where being unable to resist looking at it, is going to have serious consequences. Here's one way of becoming conscious of how strong our willpower is. We call this the phone penny marathon. Start by guessing how often you check your phone every hour. Fill one pocket with pennies or other small coins or objects if you don't have pennies. Pick an hour of the day when you usually use your phone at least once, or you can just set a timer for an hour at any time. Each time you unlock your phone in that hour, move one of the pennies to another pocket. At the end of the hour, count the pennies or whatever in the second pocket to see how many times you unlocked your phone. Again, the purpose here is to just become more conscious, more aware, to take something that is an automatic action and turn it into a conscious action. If you don't have pennies or small objects, or if you don't have pockets, you can use this variation. Set your phone face down in front of you. Each time you unlock it, put it down a little further away when you're done, and see how far away from you it's gone at the end of the hour. Now, all of us, adults and kids, are dealing with these issues, and we often underestimate how our tech habits affect other people in our lives. We need to commit and take steps to develop better habits, but we also need to have compassion for ourselves and for other people if we don't get things right immediately. Habits take time to build, especially when we're trying to reverse bad habits that we've already got. And feeling guilty actually reduces our self-control in the future. So if you start beating yourself up, or if you start criticizing someone else's habits, that's actually going to make it harder to build good habits. That doesn't mean we should be complacent, just let ourselves get away with anything, but it does mean we just shouldn't beat ourselves up. Just recognize. In the same way, you're not going to lift a 100-pound weight your first time out. You're not going to do 100 push-ups the first time you try to do push-ups. It's going to take you time to get there. You probably wouldn't feel bad about not being able to lift that 100-pound weight the first time. Now, while social media can lead to experiences like cyberbullying and exposure to extreme content, what's much more common in terms of harmful experiences is the impact of comparing ourselves to other people. When we compare other people's lives as we see them in social media, carefully filtered and chosen to make them look good, we often end up thinking that they're better looking and happier than we are. Some research says that it's the comparison more than anything else that makes the difference in whether social media has a positive or a negative effect. We can help our kids avoid that comparison trap by curating their social feeds, muting or unfollowing people who make us feel bad about ourselves. And you don't have to unfollow them. You can mute them. So I know, for instance, with a lot of young people, a lot of teens, it's considered rude to not follow someone on Instagram if you know them in person. So you don't have to unfollow them. You can just mute them. They'll never know that you muted them. Muting just means that you don't see their content, but they don't know it. We can also take active steps to have these apps' algorithms, the artificial intelligence that determines what we see in what order, show us more of the content that makes us feel good and less of what makes us feel bad. Each app has an algorithm, multiple algorithms really, that are optimized for different things. Some of them are optimized to get us to watch longer. Some of them are optimized to get us engaged, to make us respond. Some of them are trying to make us stay as long as possible. Some of them are trying to make us come back every day, like those Snapchat streaks. Each app is going to be a mixture of these things, but none of these are particularly healthful goals from the perspective of the user. So, how do we train our algorithms to be more healthful in what they show us? Well, different apps let us do this in different ways, but in general, liking something or watching it all the way to the end will show that you want more of something. Swiping it away or giving it a thumbs down does the opposite. Now, some apps like TikTok let you clear what they know about you and start fresh. And once you do that, you can consciously train it to see what you want to see. So in an experiment, I had TikTok forget everything that it knows about me, And from there, it took me about 15 minutes to train it to show me nothing but cat videos. I hardly ever use TikTok, but now whenever I do, it just shows me cat videos. So that's where we start. You start from scratch. I'll paste or share a little bit later on how you can do that. Um, it works differently, as I said, on different apps, but TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at this point all have different ways of letting you erase everything that they know about you. And then we can consciously retrain the algorithm by sending the right signals. So we start by erasing the history, and you can do this. This is a fun activity to do together with a child. They may not want to do this with their own profile, but we actually do hear from young people quite often that they feel they get stuck in rabbit holes. I was just at a panel last week where one young person was saying they'd actually stopped using Instagram because they had gotten into such a rabbit hole of content that they weren't seeing anything that they liked. So they might actually like this, but if not, you can create a new account, or if you have an account, you can use this. So start by erasing your history and then try to train the app to show you one kind of content. And you can try it as an experiment. How long does it take? What techniques work better? Liking videos, watching them all to the end, or something else? If it gives you options for negative feedback, like not interested or don't recommend buttons, test to see how well those work at weeding out the content that you don't want to see. The different inputs, the different ways that you send signals are sometimes called explicit and implicit inputs. So an explicit is one that you know you're sending. So clicking like, for instance, is an explicit input. The implicit inputs are the ones that you don't necessarily realize that you're sending. So you may not realize that TikTok is very carefully watching how long you watch a video. And in most cases, it's the implicit inputs that have more impact because they know a relatively small number of people are actually going to use those explicit inputs. But with implicit inputs, you have no choice. They're surveilling you. They're watching what you do. So remember that building a positive digital experience is an ongoing process. And by understanding how these algorithms work and taking steps to train them consciously, we can curate for ourselves a more positive online environment. It's also important for kids to understand that when we talk about comparison, everyone else is under the same pressure to always be available and to present an ideal picture of themselves. And that's a funny thing because, of course, kids will tell you, yeah, they know. They know that the picture they're presenting to other people is fake. But deep down, they believe that what they're seeing other people sharing is true. And it's really powerful to understand that everyone is in the same boat. Everyone feels bad by when they compare themselves to other people. Everyone feels like everyone else online is better looking, more successful, happier. Another thing that we can do is post honestly about our lives. If we post honestly about our own lives, the highs and the lows, we make it easier for other people to do the same. So that's something as parents that we can model, and it's also something we can encourage our kids to do. Don't feel you have to be perfect all the time. Because social media is an important part of how teens stay in touch with friends and family, and it can be a valuable way of socializing. One question that psychologist Dr. Tara Porter suggests having kids reflect on is, are you using your phone to connect to people or to compare with people? Again, sometimes the line between a positive impact and a negative one can be very thin. We know that using digital technology, including social networks, for genuinely social experiences, to genuinely connect with other people, has a positive impact. But we also know that comparing ourselves to other people using these apps is likely to have a negative one. Recent research has shown that one reason why kids find it hard to unplug, especially overnight, this is why it may be hard to convince them to not have devices in their bedrooms, is that they worry about not being there when their friends need them. So if you are setting a rule for the first time, about no devices in the bedroom, or if you're just taking a device away as a consequence, as a punishment, make sure to give them time to tell their friends that their mean old parents won't let them check their apps or notifications at night. Now, if you're doing this as a general rule, they may not thank you, but odds are good they'll be secretly grateful for it, because we hear again and again in a research, it's stressful having to be there to support your friends, having to be there to like that photo that was posted at 2 in the morning, being worried about the drama that you might be missing. It's stressful. And in many cases, kids tell us they would like to stop doing that, except they know that their friends aren't. It's like an arms race. If they knew that all of their friends were also doing the same thing, they would quit. So make sure that they are able to use you as an excuse. And finally, as the adults in kids' lives, we need to make sure that we are modeling good tech habits for our kids. So all of these exercises, all of these little tips, we need these in many cases as much as our kids do. And we can model improving our own relationship with our devices. What we do sends a louder signal than anything that we can say. So think about how these tips and exercises might help you manage your own phone use as well. So I'm going to end by encouraging you to visit mediasmarts.ca for all of our material. We have guides, videos, and articles on a wide variety of topics, of course, including digital well-being, but also things including cyberbullying, online safety, parental controls, misinformation, online hate, body image, stereotyping, really everything relating to media, both traditional and digital. You might want to look for, and I should be able to share some links to some particularly relevant resources. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. It looks like there are some in the Q&A, which is terrific. All right, so getting up at our first question. Video games now are very reward-oriented, and there have been articles about the role of dopamine. This may not qualify as addiction, but the habituation is nearly as bad. Can you comment on this? So I did mention that there are some experiences, some digital experiences that come close to the threshold of addiction. One of those is online gambling. That is something that we really do recommend you talk to kids about, because gambling, unlike many other things, has really expanded over the last couple of years. It's become much easier to access gambling, both online and offline. But the other one is loot boxes. Now, dopamine, I don't want to, I could spend the rest of the time we have talking about dopamine, so I'm not going to do that. I will say that the discourse around dopamine is a little bit simplified, because dopamine is simply a chemical that our brains make when we get something good that we didn't expect. And the levels of dopamine that are associated with most media experiences are basically on par with the levels of dopamine that we get from eating a good meal or meditating. But that being said, loot boxes in video games are probably the thing that comes closest, aside from gambling, to a genuinely addictive experience. And that is why you really want to be conscious in games. It's one of the things that we talk about in our material on games and our co-viewing tip sheet, to make sure that kids understand. First of all, early on, you want them to make sure that they understand that online purchases are real money, and you want to take steps to control it. We recommend, for instance, using gift cards. So there's a limit on how much they can spend, so you don't wind up spending $2,000 on Smurf berries, which really did happen to someone. And if there are loot boxes in a game, then you want to explain to kids why those are unhealthful, and why sometimes that may be a good reason to not play a game. That it's a difficult thing to deal with. It's an area where I think in the long run, probably consumer action and regulation is going to be the only practical solution. Okay, second question. Would you please speak more to how Snapchat streaks are programmed to manipulate? So really, they are uh, they're classic behavior modification. So for those of you who aren't familiar with them, how it happens is if you send someone on Snapchat any photo, because that's how you communicate on Snapchat, by sending photos. If you send anyone a photo and they send a photo back to you, that starts a streak. There's a little flame icon and a number starts. And every day that you do that, that each of you sends one back and forth, that number goes up by one. And you can have any number of them. So that you have a streak going with every person that you have had that experience with on Snapchat. So you can see immediately you don't want to break the streak. And it becomes because you're mostly communicating with friends. Kids overwhelmingly use social media, especially Snapchat, to communicate with friends and other peers, classmates. These are people you know, these are people you have an emotional connection to. And so that streak gets invested with that emotional connection, and losing the streak, ending the streak, it goes back to zero. If you ever go a day without having one photo sent and another photo sent back, that goes back to zero. And so that comes to seem like a betrayal. And so we actually did hear from young people in one of our research projects that the last thing they would do at night, they would cover the camera on their phone with their hand, and they would just send black photos, like just photos of nothingness, to everyone they had a streak going with that they hadn't contacted that day, just to make sure that the streaks kept up. And we were involved in a project at University of Ottawa a couple of years ago called the Disconnection Challenge. We actually have a lesson plan built around that. And the young people in that said that early on in the Disconnection Challenge, the hardest thing for them was giving up the streaks. But at the end, what made them feel the best was not having to keep up the streaks anymore, and that many of them were resolved. Obviously, you can't stop a streak from happening, but you can start to ignore it. All right, our third question. Is the issue with tech not so much displacement, but distraction and undeveloped ability to be attentive to the world around them? Well, that's a difficult thing to measure. So, I mean, when we talk sort of in terms of development and general mental wellness, that's why we talk about displacement, because we know that there are certain things that we need to be healthy. We need to spend real time with people. We need to eat good food. We need to get enough sleep. We need to get enough exercise. We need to, wash ourselves and do those things. And when those things are being displaced, and then there are things we have to do. If you're a child, you have to go to school. If you're an adult, unless you're very lucky, you have to go to work. And so if things are displacing that, then it is going to have a stressful effect on us. So that doesn't mean that our ability to be attentive to the world around us isn't meaningful. I think it is meaningful. It's just a much harder thing to quantify. So I think you're absolutely right to be thinking about that. Um, it is one of the reasons, again, why we promote the idea of mindful use, that we're not just taking out our phones to distract ourselves at every moment. And what's interesting is there's some research that was just published a couple of days ago, in fact, that suggests that digital media is actually making us more bored, that most of the experiences we're doing online are actually boring us. And it is these habitual, repetitive activities. So again, keep in mind that one study I mentioned where the short breaks were as positive as the long breaks or the total detoxes, but also a similar positive impact was found from intentionally choosing positive digital experiences that people had identified as being pleasurable, choosing to spend more time on them. So a good example of that would be a family movie night, which is something we do every Friday. It's a media experience that we choose to do together. It's a little ritual, and we always choose a movie that we think we're all going to enjoy. And I think that's something that adds enjoyment to our lives. Okay. There's a lot of I need to start answering these questions more quickly. Next question. I've limited the screen time of my daughter using apps. I have a few questions. Is there an ideal time limit for screen time daily, or a way to find an ideal amount of time for her? I want her to not spend her whole time on screens, but at the same time, I'm worried she may need to kill some time to become bored and start doing more productive things on devices. By limiting, I may be forcing her to only kill the time and not benefit from them. She's complained she's the only person that has her screen time limited. I know that's not true, but I don't want her feeling controlled and not trusted. Any suggestions? So, first of all, she's definitely not the only person having her screen time limited. We know that from our research. I should mention our research is available on our website. Everything that we do is available for free on our website. You can access it and you don't have to read the whole research report. We've got infographics if you just want to get the gist. And what really, so we do know a lot of kids are having their screen time limited in a variety of different ways. We do know that relying exclusively on technological tools like apps doesn't tend to work very well. When that's the only thing that you're doing, it does not seem to be effective. It can be effective in combination with parental engagement. So things like setting rules, things like providing more time for activities that you feel are worthwhile. Things like I mentioned earlier, like things that are active, things that are educational, things that are creative, things that are genuinely social. Making plans, having routines. Uh, there isn't precisely an ideal time limit for screen time daily. So when you look at the Canadian Pediatric Society guidelines, they do talk about 2 hours a day of non-school screen time. It's not bad as a target, but it is, I think, more important to think about the role that that screens are playing in your life rather than the amount of time. Time really is, as I mentioned at the top of this workshop, time, except with very young kids, is primarily an issue in terms of when it is displacing things. Okay. Any recommendations on apps that help control what content my kid sees, or resources to help parent configure settings, thinking of 7 to 14-year-olds? Okay, so we do have a tip sheet on parental controls. I'm going to try and share that with you before we're done, but if not, you can find it on our website. The other thing that I really will strongly recommend, so first of all, most browsers have safe search settings, but also I will recommend using an ad blocker because what our research shows is that most kids do not go looking for inappropriate content, but they see it without meaning to. And in fact, they want to avoid it. And one of the ways that it comes up very often is in terms of ads. So they may be looking at something perfectly innocuous, but the pop-up ads will be inappropriate. So if you use an ad blocker, we recommend ones like Privacy Badger for Firefox or Chrome. On Safari, there's a good one called Blockada that I use on our kids' iPads. It's going to block all ads, which is great, but most importantly, it blocks inappropriate ads because it's blocking all ads. A lot of social networks and a lot of video sites also have a restricted setting. YouTube and TikTok have restricted modes, and they're both pretty good at controlling what kids see. That's true also of most online game platforms now too. Okay. Does it make sense to enforce screen time for kids and let them have free reign to use screens during other times when they don't have specific responsibilities? So again, it's going to be different at different ages. Generally speaking, as kids are getting older, you want to give them more and more responsibility when they're ready for it. But what you want to do is gradually hand the reins over to them because eventually they're going to be out of your house, we hope. And you want them wherever they're going, whether they're going to university or college, whether they're going to the workplace, you want them at that point to be able to manage their own screen use. So early on, you are going to be managing it a fair bit, and you want to hand it over bit by bit as they're ready for it. So one thing that you can do, as I say, is you can make individual judgments. You don't have to just say you have X amount of time, and you don't have to just say between A and B time, you can do anything. You can say, well, all right, this time and that time is video game time. You can play games during that time. Outside of that time, here are some activities you can always do, or you can say outside of that time, you come and ask me. And if it's something that I think is worth doing, then I'll say yes. There can be activities you can say are always fine, or ones that you agree on a case-to-case basis. There isn't a single right answer, but what matters is that you are thinking about it and that you're modeling to them the idea that this is something that we choose. This is something we think about. It's not just something we're always doing. Okay.
Matthew,
I think we're out of
yeah.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. There are lots of questions, obviously.
Yes.
This was a really great session. So I would encourage everybody to go to Media Smarts to get more information, and I'm sure many of the questions can get answered through the information on that site. So, thank you very much. I always very much enjoy listening to your sessions. Some good takeaways for tonight is, it's tech habits, not addictions, and we got to focus on creating better habits. Take breaks. I was glad to hear that short breaks help just as much as long ones. So make a plan. Avoid phone loops. I specifically like that one because I actually get caught in phone loops on occasion. Set timers. But most importantly, be kind to yourself and others. And I think we can all model good tech habits. So if any takeaway, we can try to start modeling so our children can see what good tech habits are. So I can't thank you enough. This was a great session. There were, I think, 400 attendees. So really appreciate it. Always enjoy your sessions. And again, everybody out there, I encourage you to go to Media Smarts to get answers to your questions.
Yeah.
So
And
thank
I
you.
will, I'm
everybody.
just going to,
Okay,
yeah,
go ahead.
I'm just going to throw my email in the chat, and I've already just thrown a few links in. So if anyone has a burning question, I'm happy to answer them. Just send it on to my email and I will get back to you. And please do check out some of those links and check out our website.
All right, thanks again. Have a nice evening, everyone.